After 3 years of intense military training, I had become a Navy SEAL, joined my first SEAL team, which was SEAL Team 2 in Virginia, and I had joined my platoon, my 25-man platoon. We had gone through all this additional training at the team to prepare for deployment, and here I was 3 years to the day, almost exactly, from when I went to boot camp, getting ready to deploy as a Navy SEAL to Afghanistan. But none of that training would prepare me for how intense my first couple of weeks in Afghanistan would be. So the flight to Afghanistan is pretty routine until you enter Afghanistan airspace, when your pilots let you know, hey, you've entered Afghanistan airspace. They turn the lights to red in the inside of the plane, and they get ready to descend very rapidly into the base where we would be landing. You know, we can't afford to be in the air for any longer than we have to be because there's a risk of getting shot. So there's a super steep descent, and then they tell you to stay away from the windows, right? So you're avoiding the windows in case you get shot at. And I remember thinking like, wow, like this is really it. We're here, we're in a war zone. Like we're nosediving into bases to avoid getting shot at. Like it was intense, and I'm in my 20s. Like it was just kind of cool. Then the ramp opened, the back of the plane opened, and we all got out, and we're inside of this very well fortified base. You know, we're safe in here. And immediately I was struck by the just stunning beauty of the landscape. And I remember looking out at all these snow-covered mountains, and I remember thinking like, how is this a war zone? This is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. I don't think I really appreciated just how foreign of a place Afghanistan is relative to where I come from. We get out to our site, and that night they wanted to go, they being the team that we were relieving, they wanted us to go on an operation. We were going to be up in the mountains. And I remember distinctly them talking about the cave systems that were in these mountains. And I remember thinking like how creepy that was, that we would be up on these mountains, walking around. It's so isolated, it's so foreign, and there could be like people hiding in caves that we could accidentally fall into one of their caves. Like it really, really creeped me out. And so I was talking about how creepy these caves were, and the interpreter was like, you know, what's really creepy is back in 2002, there was this fairly well documented case of another special operations unit, the Army Green Berets, coming in contact with a creature in a cave, and they actually got into a battle with it, and they lost one of their soldiers to this creature. And it was fairly well documented, but then it was quickly kind of silenced. I mean, certainly the story was interesting, but I didn't really believe it. Maybe it was some animal, maybe it was some person, whatever it was, there was some explanation to it. It wasn't until now that I actually started exploring different strange occurrences and strange events, and I looked and found some testimony from one of the soldiers that came forward anonymously, who was a part of this operation where they came in contact with this creature in Kandahar. And what struck me about his testimony is it sounds authentic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell that soldier's story, and I'm going to tell the other kind of corroborating witness stories as well, to try to give you a picture of what happened in Kandahar in 2002, and you can be the judge if you think this is fact or fiction. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's what my channel is all about, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that interests you, I would encourage you to please gently ravage the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those 3 to 4 weekly uploads. All right, guys, let's get into the story. In 2002, an Army infantry unit just vanished. They were on patrol in the Kandahar mountain range in Afghanistan, and they stopped using the radios. They stopped calling in. No one knew what was going on. They didn't call in a TIC, which stands for Troops in Contact. Basically, any military unit, if you're out on an operation and you start getting shot at, you radio in to your higher command, hey, troops in contact, or TIC, which signals to them, you need to get aircraft on standby, you need to get ready to send reinforcements, they need to be ready to support you. But they only do that if you signal that you're in a TIC. And it's, a lot of people, if anything, will call it in too early. You know, units are known to call it in almost prematurely sometimes. And so the idea that a unit would vanish without calling in a TIC or any sort of communication about any gunfight or any ambush or anything, it's a little bit strange. And so they disappear. The Army decides that in order to find them, because this is obviously a really big deal, they would get their most elite unit, so the Army Green Berets, that's their very elite special forces. They would send them out to find this missing unit. And so one soldier that was a part of that elite special forces detachment, who just goes by Mr. K, he would come forward years later and tell the story of what happened once they were tasked with this mission. So they leave via helicopters and they fly out to the Kandahar mountain range, about 4 clicks, so 4 kilometers about, from where they believed was this infantry unit's last known location. And so they land and they start doing this fairly methodical search through the mountainside. They knew that they were in enemy territory, and at any time they could get into a gunfight, they could be ambushed. There's all these cave systems all over these mountains. And so it's slow moving to begin with. Plus they're looking for this lost infantry unit. So it's just a very slow movement through the mountains. And so over the first few days, nothing really happened. They didn't come in contact with the enemy. They didn't see any sign of this missing infantry unit. They just walked along the mountains carrying a bunch of gear, and that was it. At some point, they noticed a little bit farther ahead that there was this distinct pathway leading up the mountain and kind of around the corner. And it looked like a goat trail. There were lots of goats that would run around the mountainside, and it looked like a very well-developed goat trail. And they decided, let's just go up there. If nothing else, we can go up onto wherever this leads us and maybe look down across the other side of the mountain and see if we can see anything. And so the team starts making their way up this goat trail. And as soon as they start making their way up, they start noticing that there are little pieces of American military equipment on the ground. There are pieces of radios, like whip antennas and housing of the actual radio itself. They found military-style backpacks as well, and they started finding pieces of uniforms that belonged to the missing infantry unit. They knew based on the patches that were on these uniforms. So as they're walking up this trail of broken equipment and uniforms, they start seeing some bone on the ground. They didn't know if it was human bone or what. They start seeing broken bones scattered on their way up to this kind of plateau. And so now the Special Forces team, I mean, they're incredibly well trained. I mean, I'm not just being biased here. I mean, the Army Green Berets, the Army Special Forces, they're very similar to the Navy SEAL teams, which I was a part of. 2 different units, no doubt, but very much peers. And the level of training you get in handling situations like this one, now granted this one's pretty unique, you're so well trained that when things start getting dangerous, it's like your training just kicks in, and everybody's does. And so I would imagine that when they saw this, what they were thinking is, this was an ambush. This infantry unit was ambushed, and we're probably coming up on the ambush site. And so they're, taking defensive positions, and they're moving slowly and very tactically up this mountain, and they're keeping their weapons pointed at the leading edge on their way up to the top of this mountain. They get to this plateau. It's like a flat section of the mountain, right? It's like a steep mountain, and there's like this little like shelf almost. And there's more equipment scattered and more bones scattered across it. And there's all these cave entrances right in front of them. It's as if they were intentionally placed so that they fed out onto this shelf. And so they start moving towards the mouth of the caves, and they realize, without even getting very close, that even though the mouth of these caves are pretty large and everybody could go into the cave, there is a steep drop-off. Like, you'd walk in and then it just goes straight down, and someone kind of peered over the edge and couldn't see how far it went down, and they decided that it was just too dangerous to go in there, because clearly something happened here where American lives were lost, based on the tattered uniforms and equipment. And so let's just pull back and take up defensive positions looking at the entrance to all of these cave entrances. And so as leadership goes down kind of out of the fatal funnels, if you will, outside of these caves, Mr. K, who's the guy who's told us this whole story, he said he's looking at one of the entrances to the caves and he sees a flash of movement inside of the cave. And he looks over at it. He doesn't have time to react to it or anything. And all of a sudden, a spear comes flying out of the cave. This big, massive lance comes flying out, and it goes right through one of his teammates whose name was Dan. And so Dan's down. And so the whole team saw that. They didn't see who threw it, but they certainly saw the spear hit Dan. And so as they're shocked and just keeping their weapon up, wondering what's going to happen, outruns this, by Mr. K's account, a 12 to 15 foot tall man with a red beard and red hair down past his shoulders, comes charging out, howling like a war cry. He's got animal skins for clothes. He just looks super dirty. And he runs over to Dan to pull the spear out and probably use it again. And the rest of the team at this point is broken out of their shock of what they're seeing, and they start engaging this giant. And the giant didn't really have a chance to fight back. And in 30 seconds, the giant is down too. So Dan's down and the giant is down. And the whole team is like, what just happened? So after the dust had settled and all the shooting had stopped, they went to check on Dan, and Dan had passed away. And so they called back into higher headquarters, and they're trying to describe what happened. A very large, possibly human creature threw a projectile that hit Dan. And so they sent 2 helicopters out, one to retrieve Dan and the team, the other just to hoist up this very large human-like creature because they wanted to know what it was. And they struggled mightily to get the netting around this big creature. It ended up weighing over 1,100 pounds. It had 6 toes on each foot, and it had 6 fingers on each hand. They load it up, they string it onto this helo, and it takes off. And the team gets into the other helicopter, and they go back expecting to be debriefed as soon as they get back to base. The helicopter with the giant would fly to an airfield, and they would meet up with a crew of a C-130, which is another big military aircraft. The pilot of that craft would publicly say that he remembers seeing a 12 to 15 foot tall giant person with 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. And he would say that's what he saw, even though it was later redacted and made top secret. Mr. K and his team, they flew back to the base to be debriefed. And so they had to provide an after action report. It's something done in the military. You go out, you do any operation, you come back, and you write up what happened. And so Mr. K and his team decided to just be honest about what they saw. And so they described it again in detail, 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. It came out, it threw the spear, it hit Dan, it's this horrible situation. And once they submitted it, their leadership said, you got to rewrite that. We're not going to accept that. So Mr. K said they ultimately rewrote it, and it just sounded like a typical engagement in the mountains with the enemy. And it was made top secret, and then they never saw it again. And that was it. Mr. K said that he and the rest of his team also had to sign non-disclosure agreements to not ever talk about what they saw. And they never got any word about what actually happened. What did they do with the body of the giant? And they just never got any clarity out of it. It was just basically made top secret, redacted, and they were told don't talk about it. So it would take until 2016 when Mr. K finally just said, you know what, screw it. I'm gonna go public with what I saw because my friend died and they're acting like, this didn't happen, but it did happen. And so that's why we have this detailed report of this mission where they came in contact with the giant of Kandahar. I don't know how I feel about this story. I do think that if there was a place in the world that had the ability to mask or hide giants from being seen by the prying eyes of the human population, it would be Afghanistan. There were times when I was walking around out there that it felt like I was walking around on another planet. But either way, you do have one soldier who was killed by something out in the mountains of Kandahar, and his own teammates say this is what happened. And you have multiple corroborating witness testimony, but a lot of it's been made top secret and redacted, and so we don't really know what happened, or at least us commoners don't know what really happened. So I'd love to hear what you think happened, whether you think this totally happened and it's true, or if you think it was a hoax. If you enjoyed this story, if you would, please gently ravage the like button and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications because I post stories like this one 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that's your deal, well, then you've come to the right place. That's going to do it, guys. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen, and you can reach me on there as well. That's going to do it, guys. Take care. 1976, Mary Gillespie lived in Circleville, Ohio, with her husband, Ron Gillespie. And Mary was a bus driver for the local school. And one day, she came home from work, and she found a letter that was addressed specifically to Mary. It had no return address, and it was postmarked from Columbus, Ohio. The letter effectively said,
"We know you're having an affair with the superintendent of the school. You must stop and come clean and tell your husband. If you don't, bad things are going to happen to you. We're watching your house. We know you have children."
Now, Mary was obviously frightened. She was scared for her kids. She was scared for herself. She didn't really know how to react to this letter, so she just ignored it and hoped that it was a hoax and that it would just stop. But a week goes by and she gets another letter. This letter was even more threatening, saying that
if you don't stop this now, we are going to harm you. This is not a joke.
Mary decided to ignore that letter too. But literally the next day, her husband Ron woke up one morning and got the mail and found a letter addressed to him. The letter had no return address and was postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, just like the first two letters sent to Mary. The letter to Ron said that his wife was having an affair with the superintendent of the school, and that if he didn't confront her and get her to admit the truth and get it to stop, that Ron's life would be in
grave danger.
Ron is horrified to read this letter. He hadn't suspected anything of his wife. This was very uncharacteristic. And so he went to Mary and he said, "Hey, I got this letter. What is this? I've gotten 2 of these letters. I've just been ignoring it. I didn't know what to do." And she aggressively denied any accusation that she was having an affair. She said, "I'm not doing any of that." And so Ron believes his wife and says, "You know what? I don't know what this is, but I believe you. Let's ignore this. This will go away. I don't know what this is, but it'll go away." A week later, Ron receives another letter addressed to him, no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio. This letter said,
"Ron, it's been a week and you haven't done anything. You have to get her to admit the truth. Otherwise, not only are we going to put your life in danger, we're also going to broadcast what she's doing all over town on billboards, on radio, and on TV." So
at this point, Ron and Mary are scared. Ron is still standing behind his wife. He believes his wife that she has not had an affair, that this is just some horrible hoax, but they're scared. But they don't really want to go to police yet. They kind of want this to just go away. So their first step is, let's tell some people in our inner circle just to kind of put this out there and see what other people think. And so the 3 people that were closest to Ron and Mary were Ron's sister, Ron's sister's husband, named Paul Freshour, and Paul's sister. So it's a little confusing, but those are the players here. And so while Mary and Ron are telling, their inner circle about this anonymous set of letters they've gotten and all the threats involved, Mary starts to think that she might know who's been sending the letters. She has an idea of who it is. Now, we unfortunately don't know who this person is. It's been left out of anything I can find online. But she decides that it's in their best interest to proactively send this person a letter and basically say, "You got to stop, or we're going to pursue legal action." And initially, when they started sending the letters, while it's unclear if they got any sort of response from this person, the letters, the anonymous letters, did stop. But that would all change in August of 1977 when Ron was home one night with the kids, Mary was out, and Ron receives a phone call. He picks up the phone call and his kids would say that his entire demeanor changed. He went from calm and collected to angry, furious. He's talking to someone and it's unclear what was said. We don't know exactly what was said or who he was talking to, but when he hung up, he tells his kids that I'm going to go confront the person who's been writing these letters. And so Ron grabs his pistol, gets in his pickup truck, and blazes off down the road. It's like he knew exactly where he needed to go. But literally minutes later, it was discovered that Ron had died. He crashed into a tree and he died on impact. Now, nobody else was found at the scene. I mean, the sheriff and the police unit that went in to investigate, it was just Ron in a ditch against a tree. But they found that he had fired 1 shot out of his pistol. They don't know who he was shooting at or what he was shooting at, but he fired a shot before he crashed. The sheriff initially suspected foul play, but the sheriff changes his mind. He says, "You know what? Ron was drunk. Ron was 1.5 times over the legal limit. So he was drunk driving and he crashed." But that didn't make any sense because Ron's family said Ron does not drink. And his kids said he hadn't had anything to drink that day. So at this point, the story starts getting very bizarre. After Ron's death, hundreds of other letters, anonymous letters, no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, are sent to residents all over Central Ohio, not just Circleville, but all over Central Ohio. And the letters took a turn. Instead of being accusatory of Mary, although there was still some of that, it was the sheriff in Circleville is covering something up. And it was around this time that people started to speculate that perhaps the writer's agenda is not as clear. Initially, it seemed like they were targeting, Mary and Ron. And then when Ron is taken down, they're defending Ron. So following Ron's death, Mary is scared for her life. She just watched her husband die as a result of this horrible situation. And all these letters are pouring in all over central Ohio with the same kind of nasty language about her and her supposed affair with the superintendent of the school. The letters are insinuating that the sheriff is covering something up with her husband's death. Her kind of dirty laundry is being aired out by this anonymous writer all over central Ohio. And this goes on for years. And so finally in 1983, Mary is at a breaking point and she finally admits that she was having an affair with the superintendent of the school. Now she claims that it happened or it started after the first letters arrived, that it was just a crazy coincidence, but whether or not that's true, it's kind of secondary. And she thought that that would stop the letters, that the first thing that this person wanted was for her to admit this and stop this affair. So she comes out and she admits it and she puts an end to it thinking that's going to do it. But that didn't do anything. It actually made it worse. So in 1983, after she admits what was going on with her and the superintendent, she's on her bus route driving the kids to school, and she starts noticing these billboards and signs all over her route condemning her for her actions and saying she's this horrible person. And so she got mad. She went from being kind of a victim and scared to being mad. And so one day in 1983, she pulls over when she sees one of these signs and she gets out, she rips it out. And then when she puts it down, she notices there's a box that's a part of this kind of billboard contraption. And she kind of looks inside, and there is a loaded gun that has a wire wrapped around the trigger, and the slack's been pulled out of it. Like it's literally ready to fire. And had she been standing at a slightly different angle when she pulled down the sign, it would have fired the gun and it would have shot her. So she calls police, police show up, they do an investigation, and they look at the weapon, and they can tell that someone very poorly tried to etch off the serial numbers on the weapon so that it couldn't be traceable. But they were able to lift the serial number and they were able to trace it back to its original owner, who was none other than Paul Freshour. And so the police go to Paul and they're like, "Is this your pistol?" And Paul was totally cooperative when he was approached. He's like, "Yes, I didn't report it, but that gun was stolen from me. I didn't set up that booby trap." The sheriff, who was the same one who investigated Ron's death, he didn't buy it. And so they made him submit to a handwriting test. It apparently totally swayed the jury. They were like, "You know what? Paul's the guy." And he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 to 24 years in jail. And so Paul goes to jail. And while he's in solitary confinement, more letters are sent out all over central Ohio. And they're all being postmarked out of Columbus, Ohio, even though he is in solitary confinement in Lima, Ohio. But no one wanted to listen to that. Everybody believed that Paul was the guy, even though he's like, "How could I have been writing these letters?" And so for 7 years, these letters are sent all over central Ohio, accusing the sheriff of this cover-up and condemning Mary for what she did. And then when Paul is up for parole, after 7 years, he stands before the parole board and they deny him parole on the grounds that he was sending these letters. Even though he's like, "How could I have been? I've been in solitary confinement most of the time." But they were like, "Too bad, you wrote the letters, see ya." And so he goes back to jail. And it was at this point that Paul he gets a letter. This letter was taunting Paul because they apparently had known that he was denied parole based on him being the writer. And instead of it being written in the first person, like I, it was written we. We are keeping you in jail for as long as we can. Basically saying, "Haha, we know you didn't do it, but we are going to keep you in jail for as long as we can." And they even said,
"That booby trap is not the only one. It's only a matter of time before somebody else finds one, and then you're going to get blamed for that too."
But following that letter, the letters stop. And so for 3 years, Paul remains in jail until he's up for parole again. And since there haven't been any more letters, and no one found any more booby traps, Paul's granted parole. Paul would maintain his innocence all the way until 2012 when he passed away. So in 1993, which was the same year that Paul was released from prison, the very popular TV show Unsolved Mysteries decides to cover this story. As soon as they are beginning to do research on it, they receive a letter from an anonymous person with no return address, postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, written in the same style handwriting as the Circleville writer. It said,
"If you come to Ohio, you El Sickos will pay."
And so the staff and crew of the show had a decision to make. Is this a credible threat or not? Do we actually pursue this or not? And they ultimately decided that they had to do it now. And so they go into Ohio and they do their own research and they start questioning people that were involved in this case. And they come across a crucial piece of evidence that more than likely could have potentially kept Paul from going to jail. They discovered that there was another witness that was never brought forward, despite she made herself available. She was not used in the trial and was basically cast aside, but she was also she was a bus driver, and she was on the same route as Mary. And before Mary went to that booby trap sign and ripped it down and almost was shot, this bus driver was ahead of Mary. And when she passed by, she saw there was a yellow, flashy El Camino sports car parked near the sign, and standing outside of the car near the sign was a man who did not match the description of Paul Freshour at all. And when she was interviewed by Unsolved Mysteries in 1993, they were like, "Really? The sheriff, nobody wanted to talk to you about this?" And she's like, "Yeah, I told them that I'm available and no one wanted to talk to me about it." So Unsolved Mysteries, they air the episode and nothing comes of it. They don't get any more threats. There's nothing. It just gets aired. It's very interesting, and that's that. Really, at this point, you're left with a collection of people, the police included, that fundamentally believe that there is no mystery. It was Paul Freshour. He's the guy that wrote these letters, that set up the booby traps. He went to jail for it, and that's that. But there's another group of people that believe Paul didn't do this, that he went to jail for something he didn't do. And one of those people is a journalist by the name of Martin Yant. And so Martin, along with a large number of people, believe there are 3 additional suspects that should have been looked into or should be looked into now that could have been the writer. The first one is the superintendent of the school, the one that Mary was accused and then admitted to having an affair with. The second was a co-worker of Mary's that apparently was infatuated with her. And then the third one was Paul Freshour's wife. So they were married when the Circleville writer drama unfolded, but they ultimately divorced. She left him and she ended up getting together with another guy. So she's got a boyfriend, and the boyfriend matches the description of the guy standing next to the El Camino at that sign in 1983. And one of this guy's relatives owned a yellow El Camino. But nobody ever followed up. The police aren't looking into it. Paul Freshour is the guy, and they're not about to reopen this case. For me, the letters that got sent out all over central Ohio while Paul is in, solitary confinement, to me, that is like the number one thing that makes me doubt that Paul was the guy. Now, could he have been involved? Certainly. I think that that's definitely possible. But I think that more than likely what we're looking at here is there was more than one writer. There was a whole group of them, but it's just unclear what their agenda was. And the whole thing is just very confusing. There's lots of people involved, lots of drama. It's like the most epic drama that's unfolded in the most obscure place in the country. But it is what it is, and it's certainly a fascinating mystery, and I would love to hear what your theories are. Was it Paul Freshour? Was it one of the 3 suspects that I just listed off that Martin Yant thinks it was? Or was it something else? I'd love to hear it in the comments. I'll do my best to go through the comments and respond to as many people as I can. If you enjoyed this story, please gently bash the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads that look and sound an awful lot like today's story, the dark, strange, and mysterious. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen, same as my YouTube channel. And I go live over there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern. So I hope to see you over on other channels or here on YouTube or all of them. But either way, I really appreciate your support. And until next time, see you guys.
Whispers in the air, magic everywhere. Stars are twinkling, love we're sprinkling, dancing in the sky, dancing in the sky. You and I, oh, this magical night, everything feels right. Hearts glowing bright in this magical night. Holding you close, time moves.
It's often said that truth is stranger than fiction, and in today's story, that's definitely the case. If this were a work of fiction, I think that readers or viewers wouldn't really engage with it. It would seem like the author was trying too hard to make it scary and bizarre. They would just feel like, yeah, too much. This is not relatable. This is not relatable. But it's true. And if you were to look it up online, this story, you'd get dozens of resources confirming it's true. All the legitimate media outlets and blogs and police reports, it would all show you that this really did happen. But because it's so well documented, because it's so true, the way it's presented, if you look it up, is here's what happened. Here's the answer to the mystery, because it was a mystery, but it was solved. They start with the solution, and then they tell you what led up to it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell this like a mystery. I'm going to tell you the strangeness first before I reveal what ultimately happened, because there is a solution, and it's crazy and tragic, because this story I'm going to share with you today is actually the prequel to a whole host of horrible things that happened to a town. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, like I'm promising to do today, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that's your deal, I would ask you to gently pulverize the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those 3 to 4 weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In 1986, Annie and Jessica Andrews, who were teenage sisters, unfortunately lose their mother to cancer. It was a relatively abrupt death. It caught the family by surprise, and so following her death, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian Andrews. Now, Brian worked a lot, but with the death of his wife, he had to work even more to make sure he was bringing home enough of an income to provide for his 2 daughters. Annie and Jessica were hit very hard by the loss of their mother. They were very close with her, and with their father being gone so much, those two were left alone a lot at the house and left alone with their thoughts, and they missed their mom. And so one night when Brian was out at work, the girls decide to use a Ouija board and to try to contact their mother. And they would even admit that they didn't really expect anything to happen. They just wanted some sort of connection to their mother, who they missed terribly. So they went down in the basement, they got out the Ouija board, and they have like a seance. They didn't really do much research into how to do it or what to do. They basically just started, kind of asking if their mother was here, could she give them some sign? And so they have this kind of Ouija board seance, and nothing comes of it. Brian is not home for this. Their father's not home, and it's just those two. And after, a couple of hours of doing this seance, they ultimately put it away. And in a way, it was kind of a cathartic experience that they got to, think about their mom really intently and kind of think maybe she could be with them right then. And in many ways, the seance was a success because it made them feel closer to their mom, even if it was just for a moment and if it was artificial. So they put the Ouija board away, and the girls go upstairs and they're kind of having a low-key night and ultimately decide to go to bed. Now, their father has not come home yet, so just the girls. They're used to this. This is how a lot of nights went. And as they're laying in bed, they both start hearing tapping sounds. Now, they're in separate rooms, and they heard the same tapping sounds. And in fact, Jessica would get up and come into Annie's room and say, hey, do you hear that tapping sound on the walls? And Annie's like, yeah, I hear it too. And they're listening, and there's silence, and they hear this kind of like tapping sound in the walls. They didn't know what it was. They'd never heard it before. And the girls, again, they miss their mother so terribly, and they were basically hoping that it was their mom. They knew it couldn't be, but they were hoping it was. And so they're like, it's mom. Mom's trying to get in touch with us. She's making sounds to get in touch with us. It's from the seance. It must have worked. And they start asking their mother questions like, are you here with us right now? And can you show yourself to us? And, are you looking after us? Just like questions that you would imagine people might ask if they thought, the ghost of a loved one was in the room with them. And so it was scary, but it was also kind of reassuring that you have what they believed to be the spirit of their mother looking out for them. And when their father finally came home that night, the tapping at this point had stopped, and they rushed to tell their father about the tapping they heard. And they were happy about it. They weren't scared about it. They were happy about it. And, Brian, he's worked all day, and he's grieving the loss of his wife, and he thinks that his daughters are making it up, especially because they told him about the Ouija board. And he's just thinking to himself, they're grieving. They're struggling with the loss of their mother. They're grieving. And, he felt really bad for them. And he even considered that first night putting them into therapy. Not because he was upset with them or anything, but because he's like, this is a manifestation of grief. But he ultimately said, look, guys, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for us. Go to bed. We'll talk about this tomorrow. And so the girls went back to their rooms. Brian didn't think much of it. He was just thinking, should I bring the girls to grief counseling, something like that. And everybody goes to bed. Now, this tapping would persist for several days. The tapping got so frequent that it actually started disturbing the girls' sleep. And every time they would yell to their father to come in and check, the tapping would stop. And so it was like kind of driving them crazy. And then when they would all leave the house during the day, in the evening, whenever, anytime the house was empty. And so they would come back to the house and, things would be moved, furniture would be moved slightly out of position. Some of the silverware had been moved around, just little things all over the house. And, Annie and Jessica's father is quick to say, guys, I know this is you. I know you miss your mom, and I know you want this to be real, that you want your mom to be here with us right now, but she's not. And you gotta stop this whole ghost thing. You gotta stop moving the furniture around. This is not healthy. If this continues, I am gonna ask that you guys start seeing a grief counselor. And the girls were insistent that it was not them. And the fact that their father didn't believe them and they knew it wasn't them, it put them in a really bad spot because they felt totally alone, scared to be in their house, because now it didn't really feel like their mother. It felt like something screwing with them. And that's not something their mother would do. And so they're thinking that this is like an evil ghost that they've unlocked through that Ouija board seance. And it's now terrorizing them. And there's nothing they can do because their father doesn't believe them. And it's just consistently happening. They don't know what to do. One evening in January of 1987, the girls were together in the front room of their house. And they started hearing tapping sounds again. And so they hear this tapping sound not coming from the walls, but coming from the basement. And suddenly they feel, some confidence, like they're going to go down and confront this thing because their father doesn't believe them. They don't know what to do, so they're just going to go face this thing head on. So they head right downstairs into the basement, and there's nothing. The tapping stops as soon as they're down there, and they can't find anything. As they turn to go back upstairs, feeling a little bit silly that they're going to go fight this ghost, they notice writing in red that says, "Come find me, I'm in your closet." And they're horrified. Because now this is like confirmation that this thing is screwing with them. It's not their mother. And it's now interacted outside of just tapping. It's actually writing on the walls. And so the girls run out of the house because this feels like a threat. They felt threatened by everything that was happening before, but it was almost like the writing on the wall was a step over the line. This felt like a direct, intentional threat towards the girls. Kind of absolutely taunting them and scaring them. So they run out of the house. Their father was not there, he was working. And so the girls ran next door to their neighbors and said, can we stay with you for a minute? Something weird's happening in our house. They began to get into the weird writing on the walls, but didn't really go into too much detail. And the neighbor said, we're just gonna wait for your father to come home before we do anything. And so the girls stay with the neighbor. Brian comes home. As soon as they see Brian pull in the driveway, they flag him down. He comes over to the neighbors. Neighbor pulls Brian aside and says, here's what happened. They came over here. The girls are hysterical and they tell their dad that there's writing inside the house. And so Brian, his first reaction is, this is out of control now, guys. This is too much. He goes over though with them to the house, and he goes into the basement and he sees the writing on the wall, and his thought is like, now you guys are, defacing our property to live out this kind of fantasy. And so this for him was the line in the sand that they've now crossed. It's now getting totally unhealthy, and he ordered them to go see grief counseling. So that actually began at this point. Several weeks would go by with no tapping, no anything, just silence in the house. It was almost like whatever this was had stopped. Then one night when Brian is working late into the night once again and the girls are alone, they're in the front room together and they're just sitting there. It's been nice having a couple weeks without any strangeness in the house, and they start hearing tapping from somewhere else in the house. And they get up, they kind of creep their way over to where they think they're hearing it, and it's coming from Annie's bedroom. When they go into Annie's bedroom, written on the walls is, "I'm back, find me if you can." Just like the last time they saw writing on the wall, they run out of the house. They flee the house, they go to the same neighbor's house, and they say, "It happened again. You gotta believe me, it happened again." The neighbor says, "Stay with me, we'll wait for your father again." Father comes home, same situation plays out. He gets flagged over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor says, "Hey, they're back again," with the writing on the wall. And Brian's mad. And he says to the girls, like, "I put you in counseling. I'm telling you to stop doing this. Like, this isn't okay. It's not healthy." And he tells the girls and the neighbor to stay here. I'm going to go in that house and I'm going to search the house top to bottom to show you that there's nothing to be afraid of in that house. And so he goes back to his own house, and when he opens the door, the house is in total disarray. It's like someone had ransacked the house. And he's thinking to himself, the girls didn't do this. Someone else did this. And so now he's on edge. And he walks through the house, he's not hearing anything, and he goes up to Annie's bedroom and he sees the writing on the wall. And then he looks, he sees a man standing in the closet wearing women's clothes, which would turn out to be his dead wife's clothes, wearing a wig, carrying a hatchet. And this man in a dress is staring at Brian, and Brian's startled. The guy starts running out. Brian tries to grapple and fight with him, but the man in the dress manages to run past Brian out into the rest of the house. Brian is like so caught off guard because this guy's got a hatchet. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He starts chasing after him, but the guy's gone. Brian's looking in his house, but finally Brian just leaves the house because this guy's got a hatchet. He runs outside, he runs over to his neighbor's house, and he's like, "Call 911, there's somebody in the house." He makes sure his girls are okay, he stays with his neighbor, calls the police. The police go in and they look everywhere and they can't find anything. And they say to Brian, like, "I'm sure someone was here. It's a very convincing story you've just told, but they're not here now. And unfortunately, all we can do is tell you, you probably should not be here right now until whoever this was is caught. And you should stay with some relatives. We'll watch the house, we'll see if anybody else comes back, but there's not much we can do." And so unfortunately, the girls and the father are left with no answer to what was going on or who this person was. And Brian's thinking to himself, like, how did he get away? How did this guy in the dress get away? Like, how did that happen? I mean, they're searching the neighborhoods. He's wearing a pretty distinctive outfit. How did he get away? And so for 2 weeks, Brian and his daughter stayed with some family. But in those 2 weeks, no one found out who this guy in the dress was. I mean, Brian and the girls are traumatized. Brian feels like this horrible father, that I've left my girls alone in the house over and over and over again with some crazy person with an axe in my house. I never believed them. What could have happened to them? It would have been my fault. And so it's a horrible time period. The girls are traumatized because now they realize they've been interacting with some crazy person in a dress with an axe in their walls. And it's just this horrible situation. But after 2 weeks, it's tough living with another family member. It's a tight place they're staying. And they decide, you know what? At this point, whoever that guy was, he must have ran away. We got police watching the house. Let's just go home. Let's just go home. We'll lock everything up. We'll get a security system. There's police watching the house. Let's just go home. And so they decide, okay, let's pack up and head home. And so as Brian is driving up his street, he looks at his house and he can see that there's a light on in the second floor. And he's thinking to himself, like, I thought the police were just watching it from the outside and just kind of patrolling the neighborhood. I didn't know there'd be police inside my house. And as he's looking up at the window, about to pull into his driveway, he sees the guy in the dress suddenly walk across the window. He sees him clear as day. So he stops what he's doing and he calls the police. Police are there in a second. The house is surrounded. So with the house surrounded, police finally go inside. Now, no one's been inside the house since Brian and the girls left. They locked it up and they were monitoring it. There was no police inside the house. There was nobody inside the house, supposedly. The police, when they open up the door and go inside, the first thing they notice is not only is all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place, but there are pennies glued to the ceiling. All these pennies glued to the ceiling. And there's red writing all over the house, on all the walls and weird places, just writing, strange cryptic writing. But they search the house and they don't find anything. But one of the officers who was down in the basement at one point noticed that there was a little piece of wood covering up what looked like a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. And he found that he could very easily move aside the washer and the dryer. And there was this board that when he pulled it aside, it was the entrance to a crawl space. In the crawl space, they find that someone had kind of burrowed between all of the insulation all around the house into all the walls. And there were these little peepholes in all the different rooms that whoever was in the crawl space could look into any room at any given time. And as they're searching this intricate crawl space that spanned the whole house, they find Danny LaPlante, who was this totally deranged teenager who had briefly dated Annie. Annie had broken it off with him, and so he had snuck into their house and had been living in their walls, listening to their conversations, had heard about Annie's mother passing away, and had kind of adopted this "I'm gonna pretend to be your dead mother" routine, and had been writing in ketchup on the walls and tapping it. He had watched them do the seance, and so he had all this stuff to work with to really spook them, and had been sneaking out and moving furniture around, then sneaking back into the walls for months. And that's not even the worst of it. Danny LaPlante, after he was brought out of the crawl space, was arrested and then put into a juvenile detention center. And then when he got out of the detention center, later in 1987, for reasons that no one understands, I don't even think Danny understands, he broke into someone's house and murdered almost an entire family in cold blood. I don't know about you guys, but the idea of somebody living in my walls for 2 months doing anything is horrifying, let alone being Danny LaPlante, the psychopath that he was. But what really trips me out is when the police went in that second turn, when they had the house surrounded, and they find pennies glued to the ceiling and writing on the wall, and then they find him in this intricate crawl space. Like, that's straight out of a horror movie that wouldn't be scary because it's just too many weird elements. But it happened. And I just think about the trauma that the Andrews family undoubtedly has suffered, not only the loss of their wife, their mother, but imagining what could have happened to them, because Danny would go on to murder almost an entire family. And it just as easily could have been them. And so I would imagine I'd be shocked if they ever got over it. That's a deep-seated trauma that, I can only hope that they were able to recover from. If you enjoyed this story and you want more content like this, if you would, please gently pulverize the like button and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my weekly 3 to 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen, same as my YouTube channel. And I go live 3-4 times a week on TikTok as well. So I hope to read your comments and see you on other platforms. And until next time, that's going to do it. Thank you guys so much. Take care.